Hello and welcome to my annual video about winter flying tips. Now, if you have come into the hobby or you don't fly regularly in the colder weather, then hang around and watch the video. It'll hopefully avoid some of the common mistakes that you might bump into. Now, if you have never flown through winter before, it's actually a great time to fly. Those days where it isn't blowing a gale and raining, the air tends to be very, very still, which can make for some beautiful flying, particularly for fixed wing. But there's also an awful lot of moisture around, so you have to be a little bit more careful. But if you get a day where there's maybe a covering of snow and you get an opportunity to fly over and have a look at the world when it is snow covered, it is a little bit magical. Now, I appreciate for those of you in the southern hemisphere, this is completely the wrong time of year. But for me here, I'm starting to fly in colder and colder weather. So I thought, you know what, let's do my annual reminder of the stuff you need to do to be safe. So as I mentioned, moisture is one of the biggest problems along with the cold. Now, with something like a foam flying wing or a foam model, something like a Bixler or an AR Wing Pro or something like that, then you don't have to worry as much about all of the moisture getting inside the model. Particularly with things like snow, you'll tend to find that anything like air scoops on wings, when you're landing in particular, will just kind of eat lots of snow. And it's worthwhile making sure that all that stuff is out the model before you put it in the boot of the car, or you stick it into wherever you're going to store it, because that snow then gently melts, and if you have it the wrong way up, will then just drip all over your electronics. Things like multi-rotors obviously are a bit of a nightmare. You can use things like conformal spray coating to try and protect your electronics, but I would recommend just making sure that you have a nice big clean area that you can land in, because you'll also find that with things like fine powdery snow in particular, you'll tend to kick it around with the props as it comes into land, and it'll just end up in lots of weird little places that you don't want it to. When you finish flying, the other big tip is take a towel to the field, a dry, clean towel. All of you Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy people will already have your towel with you, but use it to wipe down stuff. If things are particularly muddy, I wouldn't use the towel at the field. I would just kind of wrap the model in the towel to stop that going all over the boot of the car or whatever it is you're using to come back from the field. Wait until it's dry and then get rid of it, the majority of it, with a soft brush. I found that if you potentially have one of the motors that's completely caked in mud, because these things always seem to land in the muddy puddle, it's just the law of sod, then by brushing stuff you can actually brush a lot of the debris and the rubbish into the motors. And you tend to find that particularly on fields that aren't agricultural, there's an awful lot of ferrous debris in the mud, bits of old iron that were iron many years ago, and they'll all get stuck on the motors. So be very, very careful with that. Think about that when you go to the field. Next thing to talk about is your Lipo batteries. They're not going to perform as well in the cold. They rely on a chemical reaction to release the energy from inside the battery so you can fly, and that reaction is a function of how warm the air is. So the colder the air, the colder the battery, the more sluggish it's going to be. Try and keep the batteries warm whenever you can, because you'll find that you'll get 10-20% less flight time easily out of the battery. Once they're in operation and they're warmed up, it starts to have less of an effect. But if you put a cold battery on a model and you were expecting 10 minutes of flight time, because that's what you were getting in the middle of August, you're not going to get 10 minutes. I'd reduce your timer to maybe 8 minutes and see how you get on. Be very careful of that. I had a couple of friends be caught out by colder batteries not having the same amount of oomph as they did in the summer months. A couple of tips for line of sight flying. If you are a line of sight pilot, then what you're going to find is the sun's going to be a lot lower in the sky, which can actually make orientation a lot easier. When I did the maiden of my Black Hawk from E-Wings, the sun was about half 10 in the morning, maybe 11 o'clock, but the sun wasn't particularly high. That bright sunshine was brilliant, shining off the bright orange tape that I had on the model. So visual help is a big thing. thing. If you've been flying in summer and you've had no problem seeing the model, it can be helpful to put bright tape on the model, but also put LEDs as well. Then you can fly in those less great conditions. I tend to struggle when the sky is that uniform slate grey, there isn't any direct sun. It can be really tricky to keep hold of the orientation of the model, particularly if you're being a spotter. It just is one of those things that the model almost looks the same because there's hardly any contrast, there's no direct light on it. So adding LEDs in those situations can really help you spot which side of the model you're looking at. And the other tip is be prepared that the model will fly a little bit differently. The colder air is more dense, so you'll find that the prop potentially has a little bit more bite. So be prepared for that. It can be quite fun. I find some of my models actually fly better in winter in that slightly colder, denser, stiller air. FPV flying, as I've already said at the beginning, is fantastic. If you can fly over something where the snow has fallen, it is epic. A couple of things to think about though. First of all, of course, is that the sun is going to be lower in the sky potentially. If you have an older camera that doesn't have a particularly wide dynamic range, then it's going to struggle. When you're pointing at the sunshine, you'll lose all of the detail in the ground, and that'll make orientation trickier. As I neglected to mention in the slide that we've just been on, having things like return to home, the GPS stuff in your on-screen display can be really handy. That can help you get back if you do find that you're struggling to get a really good view. Dropping in altitude can help as well, or banking over a little bit to get that really bright sun that's very low in the sky out the way of the camera. Although for me, I'd just recommend just treat yourself to a decent camera that's got a really wide dynamic range. The latest ones from people like Runcam and Foxeer work spectacularly well, and you can fly pretty much directly at the sun and still see everything on the ground. One big problem that I had, again, I kind of forgot this tip, which is one of the reasons I'm making the video, is that goggles and cameras can steam up. I would, when you're not flying, if you're wearing a big coat, put the goggles inside the coat with you so that the lenses don't get cool. If they get cool or cold, as soon as you put them on your face, even with a demisting fan, you're going to get condensation, and that's going to make it tricky to see the screen and almost impossible to read the on-screen display. So when you take your goggles off, I would either have a scarf that you're going to wrap around them to keep them warm, or just take them off your head completely and just pop them in the inside pocket on your jacket and keep them in there until you're ready to fly. Similarly with things like this, I would try and keep your cameras in somewhere warm. Don't leave them out in the field to get really ice cold before you go up. Then any moisture in the sky is going to condense out on those beautiful shiny lenses. I would probably keep them, if you go to the field in something like a car, I would keep them inside the warm car, not in the boot. Keep them on the back seat, and that way hopefully the warmth that sits in the car while you're flying will just help that misting not happen. Obviously, the other bit of technology at the field is you are going to be a lot colder. You're going to lose dexterity in your fingertips. Take gloves when you're not flying. Take hand warmers. They can be really good. Particularly as you get older, you tend to find that the blood in your fingertips leaves faster than when you're younger. And you will find also that potentially you're going to have a shorter concentration span when it is really cold. So be prepared for that. Make sure that you're wrapping up nice and warm, and make sure that you have a bulky coat that you can keep all this stuff inside to keep it safe and to keep everything warm, just like you are. And the last thing to talk about is storing of the stuff that you don't use over the winter. Now, the first thing, of course, to talk about is our good old friend, the Lipo battery, but not just these types, the kind of batteries that are sitting in the back of your action camera, so your Runcam 2s, things like that. Pull as many as you can out of the models that you're not using and discharge them down to a storage charge. Now, most modern chargers will let you do that. Storage charge is 3.8 volts per cell. Get them down to 3.8 volts and put them somewhere safe. I normally use the ammo cans. You can get them off eBay for like £10, £15, $10, $15. The only trick is do punch a little hole or cut a little bit out of the seal that typically goes along the top of something like an ammo can, so that if one of these does vent, then it doesn't basically turn into a bomb. But do put them away. I've got batteries here that I've had for, gosh, I don't think about that, 6-7 years that are still going strong. I tend to treat my batteries very well. Doing that will keep them very happy. Putting them in a cooler place, so outside in the shed, something like that, it's actually not a bad idea. In the old days, lots of people used to put Lipo batteries in the freezer to store them. You don't need to go that far, but the cooler temperatures they'll also enjoy as well. Where you can, bring the radio and goggles into the house. I was flying with a friend of mine only a couple of weeks ago, and in the middle of the flight, condensation that had built up inside of the camera behind the lens started to settle out onto the lens, and he ended up with kind of almost like a cataract kind of effect in the middle of his image. We ended up having to land it. Do make sure things like your goggles, your cameras, your action cameras are brought inside and put in somewhere that has central heating that's going to be nice and warm and dry, to make sure that that condensation doesn't build up anywhere that you don't want it. Particularly in places like with like the digital HD system, I'm not going to leave as many of those as I would normally leave other analog systems out in the garage. I'm probably going to try and bring as many of those as I can into somewhere that's at least centrally heated, or make sure there isn't any damp around. And the last tip is make sure that you do store your models up out of the way. If they're on the ground or stacked up, you know, kind of with wingtips and noses on the ground against the wall, do be aware that, you know, kind of field mice or whatever can get into wherever you are and potentially have a mooch around. And sometimes some of the wiring inside models can be very, very attractive. So I would absolutely make sure that all of this stuff is off the floor. It also means that if there is a little bit of damp around, it isn't in contact with your model. And the last little trick is, if you have things like control rods going from the servo control horn to the actuator, then those kind of little rods, occasionally they can get a little bit rusty if they're not made of aluminium or carbon fibre. I just put a little bit of WD-40 on my fingertips and just kind of run it along there. It's just like if you're a guitarist, then you'll know that if you don't kind of wipe down your strings after you've played the guitar and then you don't use it for a little while, when you go back there's lots of little spots of rust on. I would always make sure that you wipe stuff down, clear metal like that potentially is a bit damp when you put it away. Otherwise, when you pick it out next time, it might have a few spots of rust on it, and you'll end up trying to kind of polish that off. But anyway, hopefully that's interesting for those of you. Just some gentle reminders on some common sense stuff for winter flying. If you've been a pilot for a long time, none of this will be new, but it's, as I said at the beginning, it's a gentle reminder for me as well, because I've fallen foul of one of these. But if you come into the hobby in the past 12 months and not had a winter yet with a hobby, it's an amazing time to fly, but just be aware of those few things and you'll have a fantastic time. Thank you for spending your time today watching that video. You can find me in all the usual places on social media, and if you're trying to learn about a subject, then check out the playlist. All of my videos are organised into easy to follow playlists that, if you're trying to learn a topic, will take you from the basics right the way through to some pretty advanced stuff.